He stood outside the city's most luxurious restaurant, dressed in rags, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Please, I am hungry." Everyone passed him by, except her. Billionaire tech mogul Richard Turner was tired of gold diggers and fake smiles, so he devised the ultimate test. Hide his wealth and wait for one woman, just one, who would show compassion with no expectation. After hours of being ignored, laughed at, and dismissed, a modest girl named Clara gave up her only meal to feed him, without knowing he was one of the richest men in the country. Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of Turner Tech's headquarters, casting golden beams across the sleek black marble floors. On the top floor, in an office as expansive as a ballroom, Richard Turner stood silently, gazing out at the skyline of the city he practically owned. His tailored navy suit fit him like a glove, but his heart felt anything but fitted or comfortable. Behind him, his executive assistant, Leo, cleared his throat softly. "Board's ready for your decision on the expansion into Seoul, Mr. Turner." Richard didn't turn. "Tell them to move forward. I trust their numbers." "Yes, sir." The office fell silent again. Richard remained at the window, his eyes far away. Leo, who had worked for him for over a decade, didn't press. He knew that something had been eating at Richard for months now, perhaps even years. Power and success had brought everything imaginable. Houses, cars, vacations, women. But none of it meant anything anymore. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Do you know what it's like, Leo?" he said. "To have someone look at you and see nothing but dollar signs?" Leo stepped forward a little. "Not quite in the same league as you, sir. But yes, I can imagine." Richard turned. His face was handsome, sharp, but tired. Not in the physical sense. He looked as polished as ever. But his eyes carried a weight. The weight of pretending. The weight of doubting every person who smiled at him. "They all do," Richard said, more to himself than to Leo. "Every date. Every glance. They know who I am before I even sit down." "Are you referring to last night's gala?" Leo asked gently. Richard laughed dryly. "She said she was a simple soul who didn't care for money. But she just happened to mention her favorite car was a Bentley. Twice." Leo chuckled politely but said nothing more. He knew the boss well. When Richard reached this point in his mood, it was best to let him work it out himself. Richard walked to his desk and picked up a photo frame. It held a picture of him and his parents, both now gone. His mother had always told him, "Richard, when you find someone who'd love you if you had nothing, that's someone worth building an empire with." He set the photo down slowly. Then he looked up at Leo with a glint of something unfamiliar in his eyes. "I'm done waiting." Leo raised an eyebrow. "Sir? I'm going to find someone who doesn't know I'm rich, who treats me like a man, not a bank account." Leo sighed. "I think you'd have to fake your identity to even get close to that." "Exactly." Richard's smile grew mischievous, something Leo hadn't seen in years. "I'm going to put myself in plain sight. No suits. No cars. Just me. Hungry and anonymous." "You're serious?" "Completely. I'm going to stand outside Maison Royale, dressed like someone society ignores. And I'll wait. The first woman who shows me kindness, that's the one." Leo looked incredulous. "With respect, sir, people like you don't just stand outside restaurants with signs." "I will. And they won't stop me." He grabbed a sheet of paper and scribbled down 5 words in thick black ink. "Please, I am hungry." He held it up, nodding. "This is how I'll find her." Leo stared at him, then slowly exhaled. "I assume the restaurant staff will be informed?" "Discreetly. They know me. They'll play along. And if no one stops for you, then I'll know everything I feared was true." Richard looked at the placard again. His expensive watch gleamed on his wrist, soon to be replaced with a dollar store substitute. His clothes plain and faded. Everything about him would say ordinary. Or worse, invisible. But his eyes, sharp and searching, would remain. Watching. Waiting. For a miracle. The sun hovered just above the skyline, warm and unwavering, as Richard Turner stepped out of the sleek black town car parked discreetly down the block from Maison Royale. Gone were the bespoke suits and designer accessories that usually clung to his silhouette like second skin. Today, Richard was someone else, someone the world usually passed without a glance. He wore faded jeans with a frayed hem, a plain gray t-shirt with a stain near the collar, and scuffed sneakers that had clearly seen better years. A patched windbreaker completed the look. His transformation wasn't merely physical, it was emotional. Richard had to feel invisible to be invisible. He clutched the same piece of cardboard he had scrawled on the day before. The ink had dried in bold strokes. "Please, I am hungry." He approached the grand facade of Maison Royale, the type of place where reservations were booked weeks in advance and a meal could cost a week's salary. Marble columns framed the entrance. Two valets stood at attention, dressed in black uniforms and white gloves. And, untrained, I might have expected them to stop him, perhaps even shoo him away, but they simply gave a respectful nod as he approached. The maitre d', Jacques, stepped out to inspect the patio layout. His eyes briefly swept over Richard and narrowed with recognition, but he made no comment. He turned briskly and returned inside. The staff had been instructed. No interference. No reactions. This was Richard Turner's test, and even they, veterans of the hospitality world, were curious about the outcome. Richard took his position just outside the main entrance, a few feet from the marble steps. He stood with his placard loosely held at waist level. He didn't make noise. He didn't beg. He simply stood there, quiet, still, watching. The first to notice him was a couple dressed in matching pastel tones. The woman gave a startled gasp. "Oh, look at that," she muttered to her husband, trying to turn his head discreetly. "Isn't that inappropriate for this area?" Her husband glanced briefly, then adjusted his sunglasses. "Ignore it, honey. Probably just another scam." They walked past him, their pace slightly quicker than before. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Richard kept his gaze forward, never speaking unless someone addressed him. Some people glanced his way with discomfort, others with amusement. Several simply pretended he wasn't there. A teenager in a varsity jacket walked by with a group of friends, laughed, and tossed a crumpled soda can in his direction. It rolled to Richard's foot. He didn't flinch. By the second hour, a well-dressed man in a charcoal gray suit paused and gave him a strange look. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $10 bill, and extended it toward Richard. "Here," the man said cautiously. "Get yourself something warm to eat." Richard took the bill slowly, held it for a moment, then nodded with gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. The man gave a small smile and walked into the restaurant. Across the street, Leo was watching from a discreet sedan. He tapped a message into his phone. A few minutes later, a restaurant intern approached the suited man's table, whispered in his ear, and then silently slipped the $10 bill into the man's jacket pocket with a business card attached. The man blinked in confusion, reading, "You have a generous heart. R.T." The man turned, glancing toward the entrance, clearly puzzled. But the beggar was still standing there as if nothing had happened. The third hour crept in, bringing with it a change in temperature and mood. Richard shifted slightly, the ache in his back reminding him that he hadn't stood in one place this long in years. His feet hurt. His stomach growled, despite having eaten a lavish breakfast that morning. Still, he refused to move. This was the heart of his plan, to be seen by someone who had no reason to look. And then came the sound of laughter, high-pitched, flamboyant, and unmistakably artificial. A sleek silver sedan pulled up, and out stepped three young women. Two of them, twins by the look of them, were draped in labels that Richard recognized from Milan Fashion Week. Their nails were long and manicured. Their shoes were the kind worn only once before being tossed into a walk-in closet. They stepped out like royalty. Trailing behind them was a third girl, her demeanor far more subdued. She wore fitted jeans, white sneakers that had clearly been washed several times, and a soft pink blouse with a stitched floral design. Her curly hair was pulled into a loose bun, a canvas tote slung over her shoulder. No makeup, no jewelry, just quiet elegance. Richard saw them before they saw him. The twins were the first to notice. "Oh my God," one of them sneered, elbowing the other. "Why do they let people like this hang around here? It's gross." They both broke into exaggerated laughter. The third girl, Clara, turned her head slowly toward Richard. Her expression was not one of disgust or pity. It was unreadable at first. Curious, maybe. Calm. But as her gaze locked with his, her lips curved into a small, gentle smile. One that didn't mock or condescend. Just acknowledgement. Then, without a word, she followed her sisters inside. Richard's heart thudded unexpectedly. That smile, it felt different. She hadn't looked through him. She'd looked at him. Inside, the maitre d' greeted the party with his usual flourish. "Welcome, Miss Beecham. Your usual table?" The twins nodded with exaggerated authority. Clara started to follow them, but Jacques politely raised a hand. "Miss Clara, I'm afraid your stepmother requested you be seated separately today. Table 9. The twins snickered. Clara's face fell momentarily, but she nodded. Of course. As they were led to their seats, Richard could still see the entire layout from the entrance. He watched Clara settle at a quiet table by the window. She didn't sulk. She didn't argue. She simply folded her hands on the table and looked outside. For a moment, their eyes met again. Something stirred in Richard. A flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The interior of Maison Royale shimmered with gold accents and muted elegance. Soft instrumental music flowed from the grand piano near the far wall, and warm amber light spilled from antique chandeliers overhead. Waiters glided through the room in quiet efficiency, and the air was thick with the scent of saffron, seared duck, and aged wine. At the back of the dining room, the twins, Vanessa and Vivian Beecham, were already making their presence known. The host barely had time to pull out their chairs before they began barking orders. "We'll have sparkling water, French, not Italian, and the wine list," Vanessa said, flipping her golden curls with exaggerated flair. Vivian adjusted her designer sunglasses on top of her head like a crown. "And tell the chef not to be lazy with the truffle oil this time. Last week's risotto tasted like dishwater." Jacques, ever graceful, simply bowed. "Of course, mademoiselles." Behind them, Clara lingered quietly. She held her tote bag to her chest and tried not to meet anyone's eyes. The maitre d' smiled at her gently, though a touch of apology lingered in his tone. "Miss Clara, your stepmother has reserved table 9 for you, just over here." Clara glanced at her stepsisters, who didn't even turn to look. The humiliation wasn't new. The separation was always intentional. She nodded. "That's fine. Thank you." Table 9 was smaller and placed discreetly near a side window, just close enough to the entrance to catch occasional street noise, but also just far enough from the main dining space to ensure that no one would confuse her as part of the Beecham party. Clara sat down and glanced out through the glass. There he was again, the man with the sign. He hadn't moved. He stood just as he had earlier, placard held loosely at his waist, shoulders slightly slumped. His clothes looked like they'd survived rainstorms and bus benches. But his eyes, they were alert, quietly watching the world ignore him. Clara blinked. The guilt of walking past him returned. She had wanted to stop. She had felt that she should. But her stepsisters had been there, jeering and rushing ahead. She couldn't do it then. But now, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Would you like something to drink, Miss Clara?" the waiter asked. "Just water, please. And your meal?" Clara glanced at the menu. She knew what she could afford. Every month, she received a tiny stipend from her late father's trust. Her stepmother controlled it, of course, and justified its small size with the excuse that Clara didn't need more than the basics. "I'll have the house soup and the rosemary bread," Clara said quietly. "That'll be all." "Of course." The waiter nodded and walked away. Clara's eyes drifted back to the man outside. A couple passed him. The woman flinched as if he might reach for her purse, but he didn't move. He merely nodded at them as they walked away. Inside, Vanessa and Vivian burst into another fit of laughter. Clara heard the tail end of their conversation. "Can you believe the nerve of that beggar outside?" Vanessa scoffed. "He's totally ruining the aesthetic." "I almost lost my appetite," Vivian replied. "If he's still there when we leave, I swear I'll call the manager." Clara closed her eyes and breathed in slowly. These girls had been cruel since the day their mother married her father. After his death, things had only grown worse. They took every opportunity to remind her that she was the outsider. The soup came. A small porcelain bowl, steaming gently. Beside it, 2 pieces of warm, buttered bread. Her mouth watered, but her stomach twisted. She looked again toward the glass door. He was still there, still waiting. Clara stood. She picked up the bowl carefully, wrapped the bread in her napkin, and placed it on the side of the plate. Several heads turned as she crossed the room. Waiters slowed their pace. Even Jacques, the maitre d', paused mid-step. She opened the glass door and stepped outside, her shoes clicking against the stone. Richard looked up slowly. He hadn't expected anyone to stop, least of all her. Clara walked toward him with quiet certainty, the plate in her hands trembling just slightly from the breeze. "I saw you earlier," she said. Her voice was soft but clear. "I'm sorry I didn't stop then." Richard didn't speak. He studied her face. There was no makeup, no practiced smile. Only sincerity. Clara handed him the plate. "It's not much," she added, "but it's warm. And you deserve something warm today." Richard looked at the food, then back at her. He was momentarily speechless. "You gave up your meal?" he asked, barely managing the words. Clara gave a half shrug. "It's just soup. I'll be fine." Richard's throat tightened. Her gesture had cut deeper than any 5-star meal could. "You didn't have to," he said softly. "I know," she replied, "but I wanted to." Then, without waiting for thanks, she offered him a small smile. The same one from earlier, but closer now, realer, and turned to walk back inside. Richard stood frozen, the warm bowl in his hands. He watched as she passed through the glass door and returned to her seat, alone, without food, and still managing to carry herself with quiet dignity. Inside the restaurant, the staff watched in awe. Jacques, for the first time in his 15-year career at Maison Royale, felt his throat tighten. Richard caught his eye from outside and gave him a subtle nod. Without another word, Richard stepped away from the doorway and disappeared into the street. The soup untouched, still warm in his hands. But something else burned warmer in his chest. Gratitude. Wonder. And the beginning of something he hadn't felt in years. Something real. Richard sat on a quiet park bench several blocks from Maison Royale, the porcelain bowl of soup resting on his lap, steam curling upward into the cool afternoon air. He hadn't taken a bite. Not yet. Not because he wasn't hungry, but because the weight of what had just happened sat heavier in his chest than any hunger in his gut. He stared at the soup, the bread carefully wrapped in a cloth napkin beside it. No one had ever done that for him before. Sure, he'd been treated to Michelin-star meals, flown across continents in private jets, handed keys to penthouses and rare cars. But never once had anyone looked at him with such unaffected kindness and chosen to give up their own meal, especially while having so little. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, still replaying Clara's words in his mind. "It's just soup. I'll be fine." But Richard knew it wasn't just soup. It was everything. It was the proof he'd been searching for. After 3 hours of watching the world pass him by, after years of watching women look through him to see only the man with money, here came someone who saw him, even when he was invisible. He finally took a bite. The soup was warm, creamy, and simple. Lentils, a touch of carrot, herbs. There was no gold leaf or caviar garnish, no imported truffle oil. Just honest food. Just like the woman who gave it to him. A breeze rustled the trees above, and Richard sat back on the bench, finishing the last of the meal slowly, thoughtfully. He folded the napkin with deliberate care, placing it on top of the empty bowl like a ritual of respect. Then he reached into his jacket, one of the few designer pieces he had quietly kept under the windbreaker, and tapped his Bluetooth earpiece. "Leo," he said calmly, "find out everything you can about the woman named Clara who just left Maison Royale. 20-something, modest clothing, dark curly hair. Sat alone at table 9. Do it quietly." Leo didn't ask questions anymore. "Right away, sir." Richard ended the call and rose from the bench. He placed the empty bowl inside a nearby trash bin and took one last look at the street stretching out before him. The mask he had worn for years, CEO, bachelor, untouchable, had cracked. And what lay beneath was someone willing to give up all the glitter if it meant having something genuine. He returned to his penthouse that evening without the usual air of command. He walked in slowly, removing his shoes at the door, then sat down on the velvet chaise lounge in the living room. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, now glowing in twilight. He barely looked at it. Instead, he stared at nothing, feeling a strange cocktail of nerves, gratitude, and curiosity. Who was Clara? Why did someone like her even stop? What had life done to her that made her so selfless? The next morning, his answers arrived. Leo, ever discreet, handed him a brown folder over breakfast. "She's Clara Evelyn Moore. 24. Lost her father 6 years ago. Her mother died when she was a child. Her father remarried. That's where the stepsisters come in." Richard flipped through the pages. The more he read, the more hollow he felt. "She lives with them?" "Yes. Still in the family estate, technically. The stepmother has full control of the trust left by her father." Richard's jaw clenched. "And she gives Clara nothing?" "A stipend. Enough for groceries and essentials. Clara was enrolled in art school but dropped out after her father died, couldn't keep up with tuition." Richard's heart tightened as he flipped to a photograph. There she was, Clara, holding a sketchpad at a community art fair 2 years ago, her hair tied in the same loose bun, a smudge of charcoal on her cheek, her expression focused and hopeful. "She works at a second-hand bookstore now," Leo added. "Takes the bus, walks everywhere, no romantic attachments, no scandals. She's clean." Richard stared at the photo in silence. The truth of her life, the unfairness of it, burned into him like fire. Yet somehow, she carried herself with more grace than anyone he'd ever met in high society. "She's remarkable," he murmured. "She's authentic," Leo replied. Richard set the folder down. "I need to meet her," he said quietly. "Not as the CEO. Not yet. Just as me." Leo nodded. "I'll arrange it. No assistants. No cars. No private chefs. If she's going to fall in love with anyone, it has to be the man who stood on the steps with a cardboard sign." Leo gave a small smile. "Understood." Later that day, Richard stood across the street from the little bookstore Clara worked at. He wore a clean but simple shirt and jeans, no brands visible. He didn't enter right away. He watched her through the glass window. She was laughing. She was laughing with a little boy who had just brought a copy of Where the Wild Things Are to the counter. Clara knelt down to show him the illustrations, her face lit with that same kindness he had felt the day before. Richard's hand tightened slightly in his pocket. He had planned a test, but it was he who had been tested. And she had passed with flying colors. Now it was his turn. He stepped off the curb and headed toward the store, heart pounding like a man walking toward fate. The bell above the bookstore door jingled softly as Richard stepped inside. It was a small, cozy place, the Turning Page, tucked between a tailor's shop and a quiet cafe on a less-traveled street in the city. The scent of old paper and wood polish hung in the air like a comforting memory. Narrow aisles of worn bookshelves stood like sentinels, and filtered light fell in beams through a stained-glass skylight. It felt like a world apart from the one he was used to, a world where time moved slower, and people still noticed one another. And there she was, Clara. She stood at the far end of the room, on a little wooden step-ladder, shelving books. She was humming a tune Richard didn't recognize, softly under her breath, her fingers moving with practiced care. A worn apron was tied around her waist, and a pencil was tucked behind her ear. Richard hesitated at the entrance, taking her in as quietly as he could. He didn't want to startle her. He also didn't want to get this moment wrong. He finally stepped forward. She turned just as he reached the checkout counter, blinking in brief surprise before smiling warmly. The kind of smile that didn't cost her anything and yet somehow gave everything. "Hi," she said. "Need help finding something?" Richard cleared his throat. "I hope so." Clara stepped down from the ladder. "Well, we've got everything from forgotten poetry to first editions, but I warn you, we're light on thrillers. They sell out fast." He smiled faintly. "I was actually looking for something real." Clara cocked her head. "A memoir?" Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Not exactly. More like someone." Her brow furrowed slightly, unsure. "Do I know you?" He nodded gently. "I think so. Yesterday. Maison Royale. You gave me your lunch." Her eyes widened, a flicker of recognition flashing across her face. Oh my gosh. That was you." He nodded again. "I cleaned up a little since then." Clara took a step back instinctively, not in fear, but confusion. You looked like someone who needed help," he finished. "Which was exactly what I was hoping to look like." Her arms crossed over her chest, not in defensiveness, but in processing. "Wait, so you weren't really?" "No, I wasn't homeless. I wasn't hungry either. But I was looking for something real." Clara gave a slow, disbelieving laugh. "Okay, that sounds like something out of a weird reality show." "I know. It sounds ridiculous," Richard admitted. "But I was tired of the act. The masks. The people pretending they cared when really they just wanted a piece of what I had. So I came up with a test." "And the test," Clara said, raising a brow, "was to stand outside a 5-star restaurant with a sign asking for food." He smiled softly. "Yes. And see who would stop. Who would care. I didn't want money. I didn't want pity. I just wanted to see if there was still someone out there who would give to a stranger with nothing to offer in return." Clara's eyes narrowed just a touch. "And now you're here. Why?" "Because you passed. More than passed. You gave me your meal. You gave it without hesitation, without looking for a reward. I've never seen anyone do that before. Not like you." She looked down, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "That was just decency. Anyone should have done that." "But no one did," Richard said gently. "Only you." The air between them thickened with silence. Then Clara laughed again, but this time nervously. "Okay, so who are you really?" Richard reached into his back pocket and produced a simple business card. "Richard Turner, CEO, Turner Tech Group." The name glinted in silver font against smooth black mat. Clara blinked at it, then at him, then back again. "You're him? You're that guy who owns Wait, are you serious? You're on magazine covers. You, God, I think there's a documentary about you on Netflix." Richard winced a little. "Yeah, I've seen it. They got a few things wrong." She leaned against the counter, hand pressed to her forehead. "This is the strangest day of my life." Richard smiled again, but more subdued now. "I know. I didn't come to confuse you. I came to thank you. And to say that if you'd be willing, I'd really like to know more about you." She lowered her hand and met his eyes again. There was skepticism there, but also something softer beneath it, curiosity, maybe even hope. "You don't owe me anything," she said carefully. "I know," he replied, "but I want to owe you my time. A conversation. A coffee. Or a walk. No strings. No cameras. Just two people who saw each other in a strange moment." Clara exhaled slowly, her fingers curling around the edges of the counter. She stared at him for a long beat, studying the man beneath the label, the wealth, the disguise. "I get off at 6, she said at last. Richard's smile returned, honest and unguarded. "I'll be here." She nodded once, then turned back toward the shelves, returning to her ladder and her humming, but with a little more energy now. A little more life. And as Richard stepped back outside into the late afternoon light, he felt something rising in his chest that hadn't been there in years. Anticipation. The clock struck 6, and the golden hue of early evening spilled across the sidewalk outside the turning page. Richard stood leaning casually against the lamppost across the street, dressed in plain slacks and a light linen shirt. There was no driver waiting for him, no expensive car, no watch worth more than some people's yearly income. He had stripped away every symbol of power, wealth, and control, except his intent. Inside the store, Clara was counting the till and closing the register. Her co-worker, an older man named Terrence, gave her a curious glance. "Going somewhere special tonight?" he asked, stacking receipts. Clara shrugged. "Not sure yet. It's a strange day." Terrence chuckled. "Strange can be good. Don't forget that." As she stepped outside a few minutes later, Richard straightened, catching the fading sunlight on his profile. Clara crossed the street to meet him, her tote bag slung over her shoulder and a denim jacket wrapped around her arms. "Hey," she greeted. "Hi," he said with a soft smile. "You ready?" "I guess," she said, then added with a teasing smile. "Unless this is where you take me to your private jet and reveal that this has all been a prank." "No jets today," Richard replied, grinning. "Just a walk. There's a cafe a few blocks from here. Quiet. No flash. Best hot chocolate in the city." "Sounds perfect." They walked in silence for a moment, side by side, the sounds of the city evening soft around them. Distant music, laughter from a patio, the occasional bark of a dog. The kind of walk that didn't need to be filled with words. At the cafe, a small corner spot called Bean and Vine, they took a seat in a booth by the window. No one recognized Richard. Or if they did, they didn't react. It was exactly what he had hoped for. Over steaming cups of hot chocolate and fresh croissants, Richard leaned forward. "I meant what I said earlier. You're different, Clara." She raised an eyebrow. "You keep saying that, but you barely know me." "That's true. But sometimes, it's not about how much you know. It's what you see when someone isn't trying to impress you." Clara sipped her drink, watching him carefully. "So, is this the part where you tell me this was all a test, and I win a mansion?" Richard chuckled. "No mansion. Just a conversation. But yes, it was a test. I've spent years surrounded by people who only smile when they see what I can give them. Not many people look at me and see me. You did. Even when you thought I had nothing." Clara's gaze softened, but her voice remained even. "You think giving someone a bowl of soup is enough to know their heart?" "No," Richard said. "But giving away your only meal to a stranger, that says something. That says a lot." Clara went quiet, then looked down at her cup. "You know, I've spent a lot of my life being told I'm less than. Not important. Not worthy of nice things. So when I saw you there, maybe I saw a little bit of me." Richard nodded slowly. "I understand that more than you might think." She looked up at him again, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "So what now? What does a billionaire CEO want from a bookstore assistant with student loan debt and second-hand shoes?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Everything." Clara blinked. "I want your honesty," he continued. "I want your stubbornness. Your story. I want to hear you laugh the way you did with that kid yesterday. I want the version of you that gave a stranger her lunch, not for recognition, but because it was right." She leaned back, her lips parting slightly. No one had ever said something like that to her. Not without strings. Not with that kind of sincerity. "I'm not used to this," she admitted. "To being seen." "I'm not used to seeing," he replied. "Not like this. Not truly. But I want to keep seeing you. If you'll let me." And slowly, tentatively, Clara nodded. "Yes." Weeks later, their relationship bloomed in the quiet places. The Sunday morning markets, handwritten notes slid under cafe cups, long walks through the city's less glamorous corners. Richard introduced her to his world slowly, carefully. No press releases. No public appearances. Just the man and the woman who saw him when no one else did. One afternoon, as they strolled through the park where Richard had once eaten her soup alone, he stopped beneath a tall willow tree. "Do you remember this place?" he asked. Clara smiled. "You mean your secret soup bench?" He laughed. "Exactly that." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Clara's breath caught. "Richard, I'm not asking for a fairy tale," he said quietly, "or a perfect ending. I'm asking for real. for ordinary mornings and honest conversations, for a life that started with soup and turned into something more. He knelt before her, the box open. Inside was a ring, not flashy but elegant. A single sapphire set in white gold, surrounded by 2 tiny diamonds. Unique. Like her. Clara Evelyn Moore, he said. Will you marry me? Clara covered her mouth with her hand, eyes filling. Yes, she whispered. Then louder, laughing through her tears. Yes. He stood, and she launched into his arms, the ring pressed between them. Their lives changed in a heartbeat. The wedding was unlike anything Clara had imagined, but not in the way society would expect from marrying a billionaire. There was no ballroom adorned with chandeliers the size of cars, no sea of socialites in gowns and tuxedos flaunting their wealth. Instead, it was an intimate ceremony held at the edge of a cliffside vineyard Richard privately owned but rarely visited. His mother's favorite place, he had once told her. It overlooked the sea, where the waves crashed gently in rhythm, and wildflowers swayed in the breeze like a chorus. 50 chairs were set up beneath a canopy of intertwined vines. The aisle was made of earth and rose petals, not marble or gold. There were no celebrity guests, no photographers or paparazzi, only the people who truly mattered, those who had walked with them in truth. Clara stood in front of Richard in a custom-made ivory gown designed by a local seamstress she had befriended at her old bookstore. It was modest, elegant, and perfectly her. Her hair flowed in soft curls down her back, pinned gently with a single sapphire comb, matching the ring she now wore on her left hand. Richard wore a midnight blue suit. No tie, no stiff posture. Just the man Clara knew, smiling at her like she was the entire world. As the officiant spoke of love, trust, and honesty, Clara's eyes never left Richard's. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held his hands. And when it came time to say their vows, Richard took a moment longer before speaking. I've built empires, he said, his voice steady. But I never built a home until I met you. I wore armor for years, hiding behind status and money. And then you came along and gave me soup, and I fell in love. With your kindness, your fire, your grace. You gave me what the world couldn't buy. Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks as she whispered her own vows. I grew up believing I wasn't enough, that I was invisible in my own life. But you saw me, not the version I was told to be, but the woman I had fought to protect inside. I'm not marrying a billionaire. I'm marrying the man who stood on cold stone steps, testing the world with a sign, and found me. They kissed to a round of quiet applause and a few tearful gasps. That night, under fairy lights strung through vineyard rows and the stars overhead, they danced for the first time as husband and wife. Clara's bare feet grazed the earth as Richard spun her slowly, laughing as she tipped her head back in joy. But the transformation didn't stop with the ceremony. In the weeks and months that followed, Richard did what he had always done. He built something. But this time, he didn't build it for himself. He built it for Clara. The Clara Hope Initiative launched with a soft press release and a loud mission. It was a foundation designed to support women from disadvantaged backgrounds, especially those trapped in controlling family dynamics or economic dependence. It provided scholarships, housing grants, business startup funds, legal aid, and therapy services. At its center stood Clara, not as a figurehead, but as the active creative director and visionary. She worked late nights drafting program outlines, interviewing candidates, and building art therapy initiatives for women who had lost their voice. She wasn't just Mrs. Turner. She was Clara Hope Turner. People who had once dismissed her as the invisible stepsister now attended her seminars. Her name appeared in major publications, not as the billionaire's wife, but as a woman reshaping philanthropy with soul. But not everyone celebrated. One afternoon, as Clara stepped out of a charity board meeting and into the Blacktown car waiting outside, she spotted 2 familiar figures across the street. Vanessa and Vivian. The twins stood frozen, both now slightly thinner, their usual glamour dulled. Word had spread fast. Richard had cut off any indirect funding once Clara revealed how her father's estate had been manipulated. Clara turned toward them, and for a brief moment, the three women locked eyes across the city street. Vanessa stepped forward, her jaw tight, but unsure. Vivian stayed still. Clara didn't sneer. She didn't gloat. She simply offered a polite nod, a recognition, not a reconciliation, then stepped into the car and drove away. Richard, already waiting inside, reached for her hand. "You okay?" he asked, noticing her far-off look. "Yes," Clara replied, smiling faintly. "I just realized something." "What?" She turned to him, radiant and calm. "I'm not angry anymore." That night, she returned home to a glass atrium overlooking the city, barefoot in a linen robe, sipping tea. Richard was on the couch, reading one of the books she had recommended, The Little Prince. A fire crackled softly nearby. She curled up beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. The past had lost its sting. The future was hers. And beside her sat the man who had once tested the world with a placard, and instead had found his forever. Winter had arrived with grace in the city. Cool winds whispering through the alleys, bare trees casting long shadows under golden street lamps. Snow had yet to fall, but the chill in the air made scarves tighter and hearts seek warmth. Inside the Turners' penthouse, a sprawling but serene space filled with plants, art, and handmade furnishings. Clara stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with a cup of tea cradled in her hands. Below her, the world bustled unaware. Her reflection shimmered in the glass, not as a ghost of who she had been, but as proof of who she had become. The soft chime of the elevator startled her from thought. She wasn't expecting guests. Richard was in Singapore on business. Their staff had already gone for the day. Curious, she stepped toward the door just as the elevator opened into the private foyer. Two women emerged slowly. Vanessa and Vivian. They were dressed well enough, but the gloss was gone. No designers. No stylists. Clara didn't move. She let the silence greet them first. Vanessa cleared her throat. "Clara, you look incredible." Vivian gave a small, polite nod. "We heard you were back from Paris." Clara didn't smile. Not cruelly, simply honestly. "I didn't know you'd started keeping track of me." Vanessa's painted lips trembled into a soft smile. "Well, the whole city is keeping track of you now, you know. It's hard not to. You're everywhere." She stepped closer. "I'll be honest, we came to ask for help." Clara didn't blink. "What kind?" Vivian shifted uneasily. "We're starting over. We have ideas. Maybe fashion. A boutique. Something small, classy. Like what Mom ran." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Before she stole my inheritance and spent it on parties?" Vanessa flinched. "Clara, come on. That was her. Not us." Clara finally moved, walking toward the fireplace, her tea still in hand. "You both laughed at me when I had nothing. You treated me like a burden. An embarrassment. You watched me eat scraps while you wore diamond necklaces." Vivian looked down, ashamed. Vanessa took a different approach. "But look at you now. You have everything. You married one of the wealthiest men in the world. You're on magazine covers. You changed lives. You've won." Clara turned slowly. "I didn't do it to win," she said quietly. "I did it to heal." Her voice was calm, but every word landed with the weight of truth. "You think I owe you something now because I survived what you put me through? Because I refused to let bitterness define me?" "No," Vanessa said, eyes glossy. "Because we're family." Clara walked closer, stopping just a few feet away. "No," she said firmly. "We're a lesson." The air thickened. She let them stand in silence. Not to gloat, but to let them feel what they never had before, consequence. "I won't fund your boutique," Clara added. "I won't endorse your brand or open doors for you that you refused to open for yourselves when I was sleeping in a room without heat." "But," Vanessa's voice cracked, "you could. You have the power." Clara nodded. "I do, and I choose not to use it for you." Then, more gently than either of them deserved, she continued, "But I also won't punish you. I won't drag your names through the press. I won't retaliate. I won't humiliate you the way you once humiliated me. You see, you two thought money was power. But grace is." Vivian began to cry quietly. Vanessa turned her face away, ashamed but not enough to apologize. Clara moved to the elevator and pressed the button. "I wish you peace," she said simply. "That's all I ever wanted for myself. Now I have it." The elevator doors opened. The twins stepped in without another word, unable to look her in the eyes. Clara watched the doors slide closed. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Not in triumph, but in closure. That night, Richard called from his hotel in Singapore. "How was your day?" he asked over speakerphone, the hum of the city faint in the background. "Quiet," Clara said, standing barefoot in the kitchen, stirring honey into her tea. "Important. You sound lighter." "I feel it," she said. "Like something's been set down." Richard smiled on the other end. "You didn't let them get to you?" "They never could," she said softly. "Not really." She looked around the home they had built, its walls filled with warmth, not wealth. Her art now hung in galleries. Her foundation now helped hundreds of women. Her voice, once silenced, now moved rooms. She was the same girl who once gave away her only meal on a cold afternoon. But now she had everything that mattered, and none of it had come from revenge. Only love. Only truth. Only kindness. 2 weeks later, she called her stepsisters telling them that she had changed her mind, that they should come with their plan and budget. They were happy, and so she was too. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.